Hey everybody. So if you haven't already heard, it looks like we're going to be getting another patch in the near future here, sometime in September. And so I thought I'd make another patch predictions slash wish list and see if I can go two for two on predictions. As last patch I was able to call pretty accurately what was needed in the game, and at least they're unlikely to tackle everything, but there are some definite standouts in terms of what needs work. So I figured we'd just go through the entire gear list, and I would chat about things that I think are wrong and need to be adjusted in any given category. So without further ado, let's get started. So I kind of want to start in the expansion section just because this is pretty ubiquitous. Like everybody's build is going to use one of these, arguably one of these three, not four expansions. So Assault Armor to start, I think that Assault Armor needs to do 3,000 impact instead of 200. I'm not sure why the decision was made to make the impact not enough to stagger tanks, but there's a bigger problem with Assault Armor, which is that uh, any build realistically can survive it and not get staggered if they just assault boost rate as the impact hits them. And the reduction there is going to bring down the 2000 to about 1700, or sorry, not 1700 to 1400, and it's 30%. And that's for the most part enough to allow every mech to escape the assault armor without getting staggered. And the entire point of assault armor is to re-stagger an opponent when they use their expansion. So if it can't do that reliably, then it definitely is never going to be competitive with pulse armor, for example. So that's what I think needs to change in assault armor. It needs to just, I mean, arguably, I think the radius should just be slightly improved as well, as the latency issues can cause 60 meters to be a little bit unreliable. But I wouldn't be surprised if that doesn't get changed, and it wouldn't be the end of the world. It would be nice, and it would definitely help with some of the weird, wonky stuff that happens. But all the same, I think the main change is this just needs to do 3,000 impact. Pulse armor, I think the only change that really needs to happen to this is that it needs to stop dropping you when you activate it in the air. It makes it so that it is incredibly easy to make assault armor miss because of the radius issues. Even if you set it up well, like if you're right on top of them and they pop and you predict their pulse armor and you're ready to go, the only really reliable way to actually get and a person who jumps into the air with assault armor is to actually be below them. And that, unfortunately, there's no way to target that area. Like, you can only ever lunge towards a target. So it's just not really set upable, definitely not in the competitive levels. And so I think the only change that really needs to happen here is just uh, to make it so that, like all the other expansions, you hold still during the activation animation, and that wouldn't be the end of the world. The pulse armor users would then need to actually position before they pop it, rather than just knowing that all they have to do is jump, and then they're good to go in terms of escaping with their pulse armor. So yeah, that should be the only thing that really needs to change there. Pulse protection is kind of an interesting one, and I'm not really sure if there's a great way to balance this one, just because like you can always run away from the shield and just wait it out. I think one way to maybe make this a little better is to enhance the duration to a minute. That would help a lot in 2 minute matches, where if they save it until the end, they can force the person to come into the shield and engage there. That might be a little too long though. If they could use the shield like the shield wall. So I think that 1 minute might be a little extreme. The duration could maybe be somewhere like 40 seconds. Either way, I think this one's really tricky. Or the other alternative is they could just give it some other effect that happens when it activates. But as of now, this one's very tricky to balance. It's just it's a little too niche, and it's very easily counterable on any map with decent size. Terminal armor, I think, is fine. It already does its job, although I wouldn't mind if they brought the duration back up a little bit. I know they reduced it previously, and for good reason, but bringing it up a little bit would probably just do it a little bit more justice. 5 seconds is a little short in terms of trying to finish off a chase down. Okay, so I want to just, before I go by category, I just want to point out some very obvious changes that I think are extremely needed and are very likely to be addressed, just given the current leaderboards and the meta's evolution in the game right now. So I'm going to start with just some shield notes here. The VP61 PS and the SUQ5, if only the 61 PS was adjusted, this would just essentially replace it. Both of these shields need to have their deploy heat stats essentially essentially swapped with the 61 PP. The point of these shields should be that you can only use them twice and then have it not overheated, and then you can use it a third time if you're willing to overheat it, but otherwise you got to let some cooling occur. And the reason these shields are just so oppressive right now is the amount of time that you can spend behind the IG window of your block is just way too long. The fact that you can also separate it into several different deploys rather than being committed like the SUTT is just another reason that these shields are just way too powerful. They're just too good at everything. The 61 PS right now is definitely the best. The SUQ5 sacrifices some damage reduction, but it just has much more IG time up with the impact portion. So I think both of these shields are going to see substantial deploy heat nerfs, hopefully to the equivalent of the PB buckler. And the PB buckler likewise should be buffed, but I don't think any shield with good IG stats should be having 5 or 6 deploys, not even the PB buckler. I think the PB buckler should honestly have 3, maybe 4, but 3 plus 1 if you're willing to overheat, 4 if not. I think that would be okay. That even 4 only gives it a 1.2 second of reduction, so even if you just flashed it back to back or cycled it as I call it, it wouldn't be that long of a block window. So I think this one could honestly go up to 4 and then maybe 5 with a willingness to overheat. But that is a first change that I think is absolutely needed in the game. The next one's going to be the Lammergeier legs. So the problem with the Lamb legs is that they only ever really need to come down in a given ranked match timing match, or even like just a match in general if the players are high skill. It's not going to go that long. I think these need to burn energy a lot faster when in hover mode, given their speed. I think the general idea should be to make it so that they have to come down at least 3 times in a 2-minute window. Now, if you want to factor in kicking to get the first initial height, fine. I think that's also reasonable. But the point being is that we need more than one opportunity to actually engage on a lamb kite before they just go right back up. And right now, they'll just pop their pulse armor on the first drop down and then just use that shield to then get back up into the sky and start again. And it just creates a very stale interaction with these leg types. And so, yeah, I think that would probably be a change I expect to see in the lamb legs. Probably I would say the most important change that the game needs is actually in the FCSs here, which is on the Ocellus. So I've been harping on this point since the game essentially launched, but the reason that we have such a bipolar meta where there's only really 2 options, there's super kite or super heavy, is precisely because the Ocellus is so oppressive in close range that you essentially have to build your build around the question, are you going to try to vie for supremacy in close range, or are you just going to try to stay out of that range? Every other range in this game just does not even come close to the amount of impact that you can build up per second, and it just leaves it so that one, and given how easy it is to close the gap, even if just initially in the game, and especially with the power of some of the weapons in the game, like the shoulder lasers charged up and whatnot, the Ocellus makes it way too reliable and low skill required to make builds that just do a huge amount of damage reliably. Now, think this would also impact tanks as well and heavies, so including the Zimmerman. So if close range assist was less reliable, if it was lowered to say about 80, then all these boosters that only have quick boost reload times of around 0.5 would start to have the ability to dodge a lot of those weapons a bit more reliably with good timing. Currently, the only boosters that can really do a good job of dodging things at close range are the Alula and the Gills. The other option maybe just being those with super QBEN consumption that are low, and then you can just spam it and just hope it lines up well. But again, the problem is that with most boosters in this game, when you dodge something at close range, the Ocellus immediately reacquires you, such that unless the timing is just perfect, you're usually going to take the hit. And especially with AoE weapons, things that have like a wide hitbox, like some of the charged shoulder lasers, the Ocellus is the real reason that impact per second weapons keep being a problem in this game, whether that be initially when the Zimmermans first rolled out, then it became the Vientos, now it's the Etzogens. It's because the tracking on them is so reliable that just having weapons that can sustainably put out impact per second, ideally spread out rather than burst like the Zimmerman, it's why they're so oppressive. So I think this needs to be tackled. It'll do a huge number on making, quad bazooka tanks or just anything that just tries to stack 4 giant nukes. It's going to be less reliable to run those because most builds, as long as they're paying attention, are going to be able to dodge at least the opening salvos more reliably rather than just immediately tanking, a charged LCB shoulder, for example. So yeah, the Acellus I think is the most important change. Okay, so now let's just jump into categories. I'm going to start with the arm units. We'll just go right from the top. So I think that the Ransetsu and the Harris are in decent places right now, and largely because of their projectile speed buffs. And that is a big problem in a lot of the weapons that are meant to be long or medium range. I think that the niche of these weapons should be impact buildup per second at range. So ideally in the 260 range, just like when you start to leave the medium range zone, maybe not max range like 300. That's more like the lasers domain in terms of damage. But these weapons just should be like flexible between into the long range and maybe the upper end of the medium range. The only one that really needs, I would say, tinkering is probably the Curtis. So the Harris does really good charged attack impact buildup. What I would suggest they do on these is to make the Curtis stand out in terms of a cumulative impact per second, whereas the Harris stands out in just getting that final burst shot. Now, if this means that they want to bring down the cumulative impact on this weapon a little bit, that would be fine, and then make the Curtis just shine a little bit more. Your charged shots with this will be still useful, but the weapon should have a distinct niche from the Harris. And right now the Harris is really good at just firing regular shots, but it doesn't really build up impact all that fast. It's only really viable on like kites that are just really good at keeping range. So I think if you gave the Curtis the ability to build up a cumulative impact rather than base impact values being the shine, that would make this stand out a little bit more, and that's kind of what it needs. In terms of the assault rifles, I don't want to tinker too much with them, but you can tell just from their ideal range here, they should really be the kings of the 100 and let's say 160 to 210 range, maybe like 220. And what they really need more than anything is just a massive projectile speed buff. These should be low cumulative impact buildup, but reliable cumulative impact buildup, and their faster rate of fire is what makes them shine from the Curtis and the Harris. So these should be really good at keeping the initial buildup on the impact value, and once they reload, then it decays down to the cumulative impact. But I think if you just make these projectile speeds a lot faster, and you balance the impact value and the cumulative impact value such that they are not quite as good as like SMGs would be in close range, but maybe just a little bit less, then that's how you'll make them shine. The question then after that becomes, how do we make them distinct from each other? Well, the Turner's faster rate of fire, so I think that it should shine the most at the impact value. Basically, as long as its magazine is, as long as you're within a single magazine, it should have really good impact buildup. And then if you don't manage to stagger them or have a way to keep the impact sticking and building up while you reload, then it should decay down to a slightly less so cumulative impact value, which is what I think that the Scudder should stand out in. The Scudder should have slightly lower rate of fire, but it should shine in the cumulative impact value. So it should, if you were to average it, including the reload time, it should beat out the Turner. Damage-wise, I think these two should be pretty close, though. That's not really the main job of these weapons, but it is a nice thing to have, and is something else that should be balanced as well. Lastly, the Ransetsu AR I think should just stand out in terms of damage. So this one should just have the best attack power value, but still have reasonable impact that makes it stand out over laser weapons. That would give them each a niche. In terms of ideal and effective range, I think they're all in a good place. We just need the projectile speed to match what's reflected there. Okay, SMGs are up next. So SMGs, I think, are the full auto weapons that you don't really need to think. You just hold the trigger down and focus on dodging. So they have less skill required than, say, semi-automatic weapons or burst fire weapons, as those ones take a bit more mental energy in order to use effectively. So I think that these weapons should have a lower impact buildup per second than, say, the shotguns or the pistols, but because they just don't require you to pull the trigger or anything, you're just holding the trigger down essentially. But they should be the kings, I would say, in terms of just outside of shotgun range. I think that they're too far right now. So the Etzigen and like you can see at 236, you're well into assault rifle territory here on the effective range. And keep in mind that effective range is and like ideal range have different or corresponding features here. Ideal range is like where you can basically get no deflections on anyone, then effective range is where you start to like peter out on any other builds. So there's sort of like an average in the middle between the two that's going to be the sweet spot for these weapons depending on your opponent. But yeah, I think basically what needs to happen on all of the SMGs is they just need to bring the effective range way down. They shouldn't be encroaching on assault rifle territory. And given that they have, I think that the Etzigen in particular might need to have its impact value slightly lowered. But I do wonder, though, how much of that is really just because they're so good at long range, they start getting impact so early when they shouldn't. You can't realistically space it. The Attaché, I think, should just stand out in terms of damage, and so I'm not too worried about the impact values. I think that they're not terribly off. It just likely needs to have an attack power buff and a projectile speed buff. One last thing too, which is how to make all the SMGs stand out. Again, I think just looking at those three values at the top is usually the best way to make them stand out in their given niche. If you start to look at the bottom stats, like below direct hit adjustment, and do too much down there, you usually tend to encroach on another weapon class's niche. And so, like what happened with the Etzigens with the last buff. So I think that focusing on like one of these to shine in attack power for its given niche, one to shine in impact, and one to shine in a cumulative impact would be the way to go. I don't think that the Ben needs too much work. I mean, it's not a great weapon, but it's really just, I think a small projectile speed buff again would probably help, and maybe a little bit of attack power is needed on this. Shotguns. So right now the Zimmerman is fine. I know that heavy biped PS shield builds are really oppressive, but again, I really think if they tackle the heart of the issue, the Acellus and the PS shield, that will actually do enough to those builds that you don't need to touch the Zimmerman. Because if you do the math, especially when you factor in that something like the Zimmerman, when it shoots, it decays down to its cumulative impact before the next shot. If you look at its impact buildup per second, it's actually not that high. Now, granted, it does get really good burst impact, so when you're running two of them, it has a really good ability to get a discount on when it staggers you, because essentially if you do a double shot with this, with two of them, you're basically getting 4 Zimmerman shots. So I think that if they really want to, I think that you could maybe bring the impact down a little bit on this one, maybe to like 550, I guess. But I don't want to go too far in the Zimmerman because I think that the Haldeman is really the one that needs improvement, and it's largely in the ideal range. So that 12 meters might not seem like a lot, but it really does have a big impact, especially too with the effective range being another like 15, I think. I think that the Haldeman should have the same stats as the Zimmerman. The only shotgun that feels like it's actually functional enough in range is the Zimmerman. So match the ideal and effective range on this weapon, and then more importantly too, I think that boosting the impact to 450 would go a long way to making builds with the Haldeman work a lot better. Part of the problem with the Haldemans is that even if you run two of them, you only do about like 720 impact. That's barely more than one Zimmerman, and that's a little. And I understand that they're trying to balance it, but this shotgun should be going for better impact per second or better cumulative impact per second, I should say, than the Zimmerman, because shotguns don't really have the ability to reliably keep impact built up and to stack that stat over and over before the magazine runs out. So I think this one really needs to have its impact and cumulative impact addressed, less so the damage. But yeah, it should beat out the Zimmerman in a cumulative impact per second, and then also address the range. The Sweet 16 is probably fine. I think the only thing that might warrant taking a look at is just buffing the damage. Like, it's not quite stand out enough to make it super viable. Like, it has a huge weakness, which is that it's basically only a point blank weapon. And I think if they address the Acellus, this will take a bit more of a penalty. And so just buffing its damage ever so slightly might go a long way to making it a worthwhile trade-off and still feel like it has a place. So pistols. Pistols, I think, should be essentially the same range niche as shotguns, but they should be slightly lower impact and cumulative impact per second when calculated with the reload time. However, because they're sustained over a longer period, like they shoot over a time span rather than just burst, they are a bit more reliable. They're harder to dodge, and so I think you should think of these weapons as more reliable and less prone to catastrophic, losses when you miss a shot, but you trade off like a net, like the optimal amount of impact per second that can be built up. So again, same question is break up the three into those three corresponding stats up top. The ducket should obviously have a bit more focus on attack power, and I think direct hit adjustment should also go up, while the coquelet should be the best for impact per second. And in terms of a burst, so like while it's within one magazine, and then the Sampu should be the best for cumulative impact per second when you factor in the reload time. The Viento is a bit of a niche here. It's almost like it's a hybrid between shotguns and pistols because it dumps its magazine so fast. But I think the Viento's in a decent place as is. You really have to pick the moment when you want to put and how many shots you want to put out so that they don't dodge a bunch of them. But if you're very selective and careful with it, then it should reward you higher than the other pistols. Stun guns are probably fine. I think the only thing that might want to be looked at on these ones is more in the helms and just adjusting the status build-up resistance for the rest of the helms. Bazookas are also in a great place. I think they got a lot of work already when they had the proximity detonation added and all, so there isn't really too much to talk about with these. The Iridium might need some buffs in a couple of areas. I think that the reload time might be one of the things that they look at, just because if you're going to have a smaller bazooka, it should be reflected in the reload time. I think it's not quite as powerful as the other ones, but its reload is still quite long, like especially when I can compare something like the Javelin Beta. I get it's lighter, but again, more often than not, you're just going to adjust your weight to find a way to make this work. Your weapons are one of your most important decisions, and a slight weight discount is just not enough to warrant running the Iridium over something like the Javelin Alpha. Napalm launchers, a little bit of a niche weapon, and I don't know if they'll ever really be able to make these meta without overtuning them, but I think just improving the damage would be a great way to adjust these. They're never going to be impact weapons, and their job is to make other weapons do impact. I think these should just have a damage buff and maybe even a direct hit adjustment buff. The jamming bomb launcher, I think what needs to happen is they need to swap the firing mode. So the charged shot should be the one that shoots at the target, and the uncharged should be the one that shoots above you. That would just make it flow much better. So the big issue with this is that you can't realistically keep it on your shoulder and then swap to it really quickly and deploy it when you need it, so that you can actually use your weapons when not having this equipped. Because you have to charge it, it's just too slow for PvP, and when you swap to it, you don't have time to do the charge up anymore, which means you're forced to essentially keep it in your hand ready and charged as soon as they're in the range that you might be needing it at, and that's just not very good flow. Stun bomb launchers I think are fine. They already got addressed. Flamethrower, I think this one's fine too. Maybe make the magazine a little bigger would be nice though. Laser rifles, I think the only one that's in a really bad place right now is the LRB. It just, like, if you do the damage per second on this thing compared to the other ones, it just does not make sense. The LRA is so hard to justify ever. I think they got to bring the damage down on this, but another thing too is to focus on a niche for each of them. So the LRB should really be good damage on its shot, bring it down a little bit, but we want to encourage people to use the charged attack on it. That is what makes this thing unique. It has the highest charged attack power by a good margin, but no one really uses it that way. They just blast with it because it just has such better attack power per second in general than the LRA, which I think the LRA should have that niche. The LRA should have the best attack power per second. Again, being higher than assault rifles, the laser rifles niche is just damage at the cost of not great impact buildup. And then the laser rifle, I think that the way they're going to have to distinguish these is as they've done here with the effective range. I think that the LR rifle should have even better attack power, but it shouldn't have the same range as the LRA. Should have better attack power per second. I think that the cooling could be a way to distinguish these two. So like one of them should overheat a little faster, and the other one should be a bit more sustained but lower damage overall per second. The laser shotgun, speeding up the charge up time would be a great way to make this better. It is a little bit too long to ever really warrant doing like consecutive charge up shots, and that is what makes this shotgun different than the Werger. It has the ability to charge up, fire, and then immediately start charging up again, but you never see that happen in PvP just because the charge up animation is too slow. So I think they got to make it so that that is a little bit more quick and feels and makes it flow a little bit nicer. Laser pistol, this is basically just a damage per second weapon at extreme close range. I think the effective range needs to come down on this, though. It is way too far. It's competing with laser rifles, so I think this one should, at most, kind of peak out at around 200, and the other ones, and then the ideal range be less than that, like 100 and, I don't know, 150. Plasma weapons, so plasma swaps with the coral swaps are a big problem in the game right now. I think that bringing the attack power is just all that's needed on this one. The Nebula seems fine, though. In terms of niche, I think one of them having more focus on the uncharged attack, one having more focus on the charged attack is kind of what they already did here. They just went a little bit too far on the attack power. And then same for the redshift. I think that this one I would just address the heat buildup. So it can, because laser swaps give it enough time to charge or to cool down a little bit too fast. I think that they got to address the cooling on this. It cools way too fast, and they could also potentially look at the heat buildup. The Walt, I would just buff the first charge damage. I think that's the only thing that's really needed on this one. Kurosawa seems fine. The pulse guns, I think that the PA interference stat needs to be addressed. I think a 5 times multiplier is, well, maybe not that stat, maybe just the impact value itself is what needs to be addressed, because it doesn't really do a great job of punishing shield deploys. I think that most of the shields that people use that parry well do enough reductions, like it basically reduces you to 1/5, such that this only does regular impact while you're hitting the parry windows. These need to be recalibrated around the effect that they would have during the parry window, not on the unparry window, because that is how shields are for the most part used in this game, is just around the IG windows. Missile launchers are all fine. I don't think there's anything major needed changes here. Okay, we'll get to my bread and butter here, melee weapons. So I think that one global, there's a lot of work that's needed in melee, and it really shows just in terms of what weapons are the only ones that ever get used. But I think first off, all melee weapons need their PA interference stats dramatically adjusted here. The multiplier on there is balanced around non-IG windows as well, and those all need to get calibrated around what they'll do during a parry frame. So I think that on average, the range should be around 200 with the highest shield effective melee weapons, like the Pulse Blade should probably do around 260, while maybe 280, which is almost a 3 times multiplier. But that should basically make it so that you take about 700 impact buildup if you take a charged Pulse Blade to a parry frame on your shield, which is reasonable. It'll really encourage, and I'll get to when I talk more about the shields, it'll really encourage people to use the actual parry shield if you want to parry melee weapons, so the PV buckler, but because it has such a high reduction. Whereas the PS shield will sort of become like middling. You'll take 700 if you use that one. Maybe 600 is fine. I'm not really 100% on that one, but going from 1200 to 700 seems fine for a weapon that's supposed to break shields. On the low end, in the middle, I should say, laser weapons should be the next highest PA interference, and then the very bottom should be things like the plasma thrower, the explosive thrower, and the pile bunker. These are kinetic weapons, so they should probably still sit around 1.4 in terms of their PA interference stats. Okay, so that's just a general change. Another thing I think it needs to happen across the board is that all melee lunging, and this is more of a booster change, but almost all melee lunging needs to have an energy cost reduction in terms of the lunge. So when they made the patch that sped up lightweights, they didn't recalibrate any of the melee weapons. And that, unfortunately, is a devastating hit because melee is all or nothing. If you don't have the ability to close the gap, you just simply lose. And especially given that the booster like the Kakaku has nothing going for it except for its energy efficiency on its melee lunge and its melee lunge speed. Maybe its assault boost. energy consumption can be noted, but that really is secondary as it's a very slow assault boost anyways. It's really just meant to keep you point blank once you've gotten the gap closed. But almost all the melee lunging needs to have an energy cost reduction. More specifically, though, many of the melee weapons have problems with their animations, and that's what really prevents them from being used in any sort of competitive fashion. So let's just go down in order. The pile bunker, I think, needs its light lunge tracking and its lunge speed to be sped up. Particularly at the end, it's very hard to ever make the pile bunkers punch work, and it's just because it's tracking issues. It should be pretty good at being like you kind of want it to have the incentive to use its light punch, and it just doesn't get the ability to ever do it because it's just, unfortunately, its tracking is just off the wall bad. So that's what's needed there. I think the explosive thrower is fine. It's already very common, and I would arguably say it's pretty close to meta. The explosive thrower definitely beats it out, but there are places for this one. The double trouble just needs its charge up animation reduced a lot, and its damage reduction and impact reduction when it's up reduced a lot. I think this weapon should double as almost like a physical shield weapon that, as long as you're not assault boosting, you can kind of block pretty efficiently with it while it's charging up. There's no real risk to doing that because you won't be able to move as fast as the opponent anyways if you can't assault boost. And then one other change too, I think that the light attack needs to do a mini stun on both of its slashes. So it right now it doesn't really do that, and it makes it very hard to ever justify throwing it out there. And that's true for a lot of melee weapons, by the way. I think that a lot of them really need a mini stun added to their lunges, because if you have a melee weapon and you do a lunge, if it doesn't have a mini stun, that's basically you just agreeing to a trade. And if the opponent knows that, they're going to punish you with both of their shoulder weapons or both of their hands, and you're just almost never going to get a favorable trade. It's one of the reasons that the Pulse Blade is just one of the best melee weapons, or arguably the best, is just because it has a decent lunge with a mini stun. I think there are places for melee weapons with light lunges and chase down lunges that don't have a mini stun, but it better have something else to be a big justify on that, because that is a major weakness. And that goes for the pile bunker too. I think the light lunge should also have a mini stun as well. The stun baton, its tracking is the main problem with its light attacks, and its charge attack has a couple issues. So I think that the light lunge should be slightly sped up to be close, like basically the dagger. And I think the charge attack animation needs to be sped up. Right now, it's nigh impossible to guarantee it, even as a stagger punish. You have to already have it equipped, and you have to be extremely close. And you can never use it anywhere else in the fight other than the stagger punish right now because of its issues. Also, I think the charge attack should also have a mini stun again. And then there's an issue with the stun grenade plant. So if people take the hit but then pull a shield when the detonation happens, it still blocks the detonation. That doesn't make any sense. You've basically planted them with a grenade inside their mech. Why does putting a shield in front of them block the attack? Nobody knows. But that definitely needs to be fixed, because the standout feature of this stun baton is supposed to be that when you've punished them, like stagger punished them, they start their next, when they wake up, they start with more impact buildup again. And so now that's a very soft benefit as is, because a lot of times a lot of millions will just outright win the match if they get a stagger punish. So this really needs to have a very strong charge attack to warrant such a weak a weak niche in the game. So yeah, just that heavy attack needs a couple of changes. Fix the detonation, speed up the charge attack animation, and add a mini stun to it, and encourage us to try to use it before the stagger so that it's actually got a place and does really good cumulative impact buildup, which should be its burst impact buildup, which should be its niche. The laser dagger is pretty good. The only thing I think really needs to be looked at on this one is the charge attack. Its vertical tracking is really wonky, and its horizontal tracking is really wonky. I think that they just need to make it a little bit more generous, as it almost never lands unless the person just runs right into you, which is not great. I won't sweat it if they don't fix that. The dagger's not bad, but again, especially if they just fix the lunging animations and energy costs and speeds in the game across the board with the boosters, that would honestly, I think, be enough. The PA interference, I think I'm not going to talk about that on any of the other melee weapons, but that obviously still stands from my earlier points. The laser blade, honestly, the light lunge is just mainly what needs work here. I think that this one does have a place for not having a mini stun because its charges hack has a mini stun instead. So this one should be the trade-off on this melee weapon. It's basically the antithesis of the pulse blade. Pulse blade is better at chase downs, but the laser blade is better at defensive play. That said, it still needs to have a reasonable light lunge, and right now the animation is really wonky. Like it has this sort of slow startup, and you can't afford that when you're trying to chase something down. Like if we just compare that to the pulse blade, where you immediately start moving essentially, and you move a lot faster, whereas this one almost speeds up and then slows down before the slash. So they got to fix that animation. Okay, moving on. The slicer, I think the slicer is fine. Honestly, this one's been one of my favorites for a reason. The laser lance also seems fine, very tricky to dodge. It already has a great place. It's just a bit of a niche weapon, but that's fine if we have that. The hammer, I think, probably needs the base impact slightly lowered. It does a little bit too much impact buildup, and maybe even a cumulative impact should come down a bit. Its standout is supposed to be a deterrent from going close to them, not a stagger punish. And right now it just does everything. It's got the cooling could also potentially be the main change to this one. I think that making this one have a very long cooling rather than a very short cooling would warrant not even adjusting the rest of the values. If you bait it out, at least then you've got a decent window to try to close the gap and get your punish. Maybe the Coral Blade's cooling would make a lot of sense on this weapon. You get one shot to use it. It's a crazy strong deterrent, but if you mess it up, then you're open for some counterattacks for quite a while. Pulse Blade is fine. I think this is one of the few ones that is actually in a great place. The Moonlight and the Redshift still, even still with the generator changes, still don't really shine from each other. I think the Moonlight needs to have mini stuns, while the Redshift should shine on damage and just penetrating defenses because it's coral damage. Maybe just that small change, like adding mini stuns to the light slashes on the Moonlight would be a great way to make this one stand out. Or maybe even just on the first slash. Maybe just the first one should have a mini stun so that if you land it, you combo the second one. But if you dodge the first one, the second one you can punch through, albeit getting slowed down. Coral Oscillator, it's mainly just the cooling, and the light lunge animation has issues where even if you do a triple punch combo extend, and then you shoot, you do a heavy weapon extend by shooting the Zimmerman while you swap the weapon, you still don't have time to land the punish, unlike almost all melee weapons, because if they have a shield, they can deploy it and parry the weapon when you go in for your punish because of that long wind-up animation. So I think all that needs to happen with this one, for the most part, is just speed up that light lunge animation where he does like the sort of overhead slash down at the end. Just speed that up by I don't know, 10 frames or so, or whatever it is. I just cut it by a third, as it's so close to landing, it just isn't quite there, and they can actually deploy the shield as long as they don't quick boost, and that shouldn't be the case for a melee weapon going for a punish at the end of a punch extend, or a punch Zimmerman extend. Okay, we'll take a look at shoulder weapons, including the left side exclusive ones. I've already talked about the PS shield and SU, so I'll skip those ones. The SU R8. So this shield is supposed to be the one that shines in its damage and impact reduction in the non-IG window. Problem with that is that many weapons' impact values are so scaled up over their cumulative impact, and given that shields convert whatever hits them after reduction to 100% cumulative impact, that needs to be recalibrated. So I think largely what this shield should do is have the impact reduction brought up to maybe 60%, just because it's a little too underpowered to ever warrant using this shield. The only thing I would say, 60 might be a little high. I'm not sure where the perfect value is, but maybe another option would be to just buff the IG damage mitigation and impact mitigation on it a little bit. I'm just wary because it has a high heat deploy. What do you call it? It has a good heat deploy stat, and you're running the risk of turning it into basically the next PS shield. So I'm not 100% on this shield on how to balance it, but just know that it has problems with its damage and impact mitigation values precisely because of the way that impact works with this game and converting the impact into 100% accumulative impact once it's been reduced. So maybe a slight buff to impact dampening, maybe 60 is too high, call it 55, and the damage mitigation is probably fine. That is largely where it needs to shine though. The PB Buckler I already talked about. The SUTT I think is fine as is too. This one is fairly well balanced. The only thing that might stand out on it is just reducing the heat deploy buildup a little bit. It still should not be able to do 2 consecutive, so it can't be 500. It's got to be like, I'd say 600 would be fine on this shield. The Scudam, again, very niche, but already has a place on Lamkite, so I wouldn't change too much on this one. The coil shield's definitely been over nerfed. I would bring up the IG impact dampening a little bit. Again, it shouldn't be a parry shield, but it's a little too weak right now. Maybe the damage mitigation as well on the parry window is a bit too underpowered now. Maybe make it 72 would be fine. All right, the Xiao Wei. I think this thing is a little too underpowered in terms of attack power. What is the role of this thing is a question. I don't think it's impact buildup, as the Huxley is just better at working for that, as it helps your weapons function more efficiently. So I think this one should really focus more on attack power and direct hit adjustment. The spread bazooka is, I think the range is largely a bit of an issue with this one. It's a little too point blank. It's quite strong on paper, but it's just, maybe its firing stance is also a little too long. I think that could take a look at on this weapon, as you never really see this anymore. It's just a little too slow and a little too unreliable for, even though its stats look good on paper, especially with that reload time and the impact values. The earshot's fine as well. That's obviously very common. The Songbird, I think speeding up the projectile and maybe the interval between the 2 shots would also help. I think that also is a bit of a problem with this weapon. Needle launcher is fine as well. Maybe the PA interference stat should be added to this weapon though. It is supposed to break shields. All of the laser cannons suffer from the same problem. They have way too much impact for laser weapons. They are great at staggering, even though they're supposed to be damage weapons. So I think across the board, all of these need to see a reduction on the impact stat. Arguably cutting it in half. I think that 350, for example, on this is fine, and then 450 on the charged shot of this one. Like, doing 2 of these for almost 1,000 impact is plenty. There's no reason that these should be hitting as stagger weapons when that's supposed to be the kinetic weapon domain. The plasma cannon, again, this one's meta, so I wouldn't, like at least on tanks it is, I wouldn't worry too much about changing that one. The pulse cannon also is fine. The only thing I think, actually no, this one's fine, because when you think about the microwave build, when they just go hard into this, it is very hard to approach and is a very punishing build style. So no, I think this is fine. The PA interference is fine. The only thing, if they want to tinker it around a bit to make it more effective on shields, wouldn't be surprising to me. The pulse shield launcher just needs a bigger magazine. I think it should have 4 instead of 3, and the reload speed being just a bit faster would help out a lot too. I think bringing it from 6 seconds to 5 would do wonders. It is a very niche thing already, and it's basically just to help you shut down people from rushing you on their initial assault boost, forcing them to at least give you a bit of space once. By giving you 4 in the magazine, you'd get the ability to deploy 2 shots twice, which I think would go a long way to making this a bit more viable. It does always feel like you're just a little short with that thing. The missiles are all mostly fine here. I don't think there's too much to talk about in all of these. The only standout ones are the vertical missiles, which I think is honestly a typo. So most of the missiles stop adjusting trajectory after either 4 or 5 meters. The vertical missiles stop at 45 meters, which almost looks like they double entered the value as 4 and 5. So I'm pretty sure that's the problem. The only thing is, I think vertical missiles run the risk of becoming way too reliable. So I think that what the niche these should fill is they should have the worst impact and cumulative impact buildup of any of the missiles, but they should be reliable, where every time you shoot them, unless they happen to dodge as they're landing, they should hit pretty much all the time. And that is a very powerful tool. But especially for melee, I think these ought to be the best melee missiles, but because they never land, even if they're just moving, they don't have a place. So yeah, I think just bring the impact and cumulative impact substantially less than other missiles, but make it so it lands almost 100% of the time, and they'll have a great place. In my mind, I think bringing it to like half of what other missiles do would be a reasonable change. Homing missiles are fine. The container missile, I think that this thing just is not good at all. Well, for one, fix the firing trajectories. A lot of times it just like shoots into the ground. I don't know why, but another issue too with it is that it takes way too long to reload for its weight. So maybe bring the weight down as well, and bring the reload time down would also be a reasonable change to this. The cluster missile, delivery boy, honestly, the UAV that shoots it just needs to be sped up dramatically. I think that the whole dropping animation should take place over like no more than 5 seconds. Like it should drop a big bomb when you shoot it, and it should drop another bomb after like a 2-second delay. The current situation with it, the fight is not even taking place where the missile was initially fired when you use this. The soup is fine. The Jav beta, I think, got a bit of a bad change where they made the trajectory so unreliable. Again, this is another close quarters missile. I think that what should make this one stand out compared to the vertical missiles is that it should have really good burst impact and a cumulative impact and be very reliable. It just should have its range brought down a little bit. I think bringing its effective range from 360 to 250 would be a great change. You should have to shoot it at basically melee range in order to make it have enough time to catch an opponent that's backpedaling quite quickly. It also stands out as it can bypass shields too, but so should the vertical missiles. Needle launcher I think is fine. Plasmas are all fine. I do think that the 706 PM doesn't stand out enough from the 703, and so I think making this one do more damage or impact, or maybe both, would make sense. Coral missile's fine, and I think the Huxley just needs to last a little bit longer before overheating and should cool slightly faster. This weapon is meant to be like okay, your other weapons become more efficient when you're using it in terms of impact buildup. So, and the Huxley just contributes a small amount, but it does run out quite quickly, and I think that probably should be just tuned up a little bit. Whereas the laser orbit is more of just a passive damage weapon, I think that it needs to shoot like twice as fast and basically get twice as many shots off in the window that it currently does. Laser turrets, same sort of thing. They don't shoot fast enough. They shoot so slow that it's easy to just dodge every single shot. Which you could argue maybe that forces you to dodge and that it sets them up for a punish if they can predict when you're going to dodge, but it's just a little too slow and niche, and a lot of times you're out of range of it by the time you are actually primed for a setup punish. So I think this just needs to fire faster. And the laser drone I think is also fine. I'm not going to go too far into all of the different body pieces here. I do think there are a couple of standouts that need to be looked at. Namely, I think the Alba is a little too low on EN supply efficiency for what it is as a low EN recharge delay core. It's almost never actually having a good EN situation, so that probably needs to be brought up just a little bit. Another standout is the Orbiter, which seemingly has no niche, so it really needs to have something to make it stand out compared to other other cores in a similar vein. And then also the VP40S is just outright beaten by the Mind Alpha in 99.9% of all cases. So it's close. I think that one thing that's probably needed, I don't know if it should be this booster or the Alba, but basically make a lower stability version of this one that has better booster efficiency. But isn't such a fragile core like the Nock is. Now, granted, this one obviously has its niche, and we don't want to encroach on it. But I think we need something in the middle between a Nock and a Mind Alpha. That in theory is the Alba, but it isn't there. It just doesn't have the EN supply efficiency to really warrant it even close to something like the Mind Alpha. So that's all I'm going to say about cores. Those three that I mentioned definitely need to be looked at. I wouldn't mind if one of the arms got a melee specialization of 1.3. That would be nice too. We don't really have anything in the middle ground here. Granted, I think melee is a very committal playstyle, so it won't surprise me if they don't do that. And then in legs, I already talked about the land legs. The only thing I'll also add, because I don't really know reverse joints that well, but I do think that the heavy bipeds need a greater range of jump distance. I don't really care about jump height that much, but the jump distance is way too locked in on one given range, except for the knock legs. I think we should see like a couple of these run in the 150 range just to give them a bit better dodge and justify running the lighter legs over the heavies every time, because it just feels like midweights cannot dodge anything. Granted, the Acellus will help with that if they change that, but honestly, we need at least a couple biped legs that jump in the 130 to 150 range, and ideally some of the lighter ones. Boosters, I already talked a little bit about melee lunging and bringing up the melee attack EN consumption ceiling, like discounts, so that all the boosters are better on EN lunging or EN cost when lunging. I think that the Kikaku definitely needs this. I think that honestly the Kikaku though should have a melee attack thrust lift, a slight one from 14,000 thrust to maybe 15,500, and the Flugel should take the place of the Kikaku, because right now the only melee lunging booster that is in any way actually viable at higher skill levels is the Kikaku. But that shouldn't be the case. I feel like the Kikaku should be almost very good at melee lunging, even at higher levels, and the Flugel should fill the role as the one that just barely has enough lunge, like the Kikaku does now. However, it doesn't have quite the EN discount, and it instead has a lot more defensive features to it. So a big one for the Flugel, I think, that is needed, and honestly, if I could only make one change, this would be it. Bring the QB reload time between the Alula and the Kikaku. So I think 0.42 seconds would be great. It would give you a, like, not quite as evasive as the Alula, but it just would do a better job of being an evasive melee booster. Currently, it's just a little too clunky and you just can't dodge quite enough. Another thing too might be to lift up the assault boost thrust, basically make it the reverse of the Kikaku. Whereas the Kikaku has good EN consumption assault boost, the Flugel has good AB thrust, but not as good AB EN consumption. And the melee thrusting is not as good on EN consumption, but you get some other benefits on the other aspects, like the more defensive aspects of the build. But keep in mind, this is a melee booster, so it needs to be able to close the gap, and that is the big question with boosters like this: is how do you close the gap when your assault boost isn't fast enough and your melee lunging is too EN expensive to ever do it reliably and close the gap. Lastly, I think all these boosters are fine. I think the only other booster that I really want a major change to is the Alula. The Alula is just way too best in class. It's got all four of its stats that are basically S tier. It's got four of them, whereas all the other boosters that are really good only have three. And I'm more looking at performance stats, not EN stats. So these are stats that change the way your mech moves. Your thrust speed is a big one. I think that is the one that needs to come down on the Alula. So the Alula is supposed to be a high EN intensive booster, but it's really not. Like, most people just use this booster to backpedal and kite, and then they just take advantage of the fact that you get all the rest for free. You obviously can't get rid of the assault boost thrust, because especially if you're going to nerf the thrust, because as a lightweight you do need to be able to stay on top of basically any mech, so that has to stay. The QB dodging reload time is definitely the Alula's niche. It is a hyper evasive booster with really good assault boost for chase down. But and you don't want to get rid of the QB thrust because those stats go hand in hand. So the only one we can really adjust is the thrust. That does beg the question then, what does the gills do? Well, the gills is supposed to be a defensive version of the Alula. It's supposed to backpedal kite and still have QB dodge, but it's a bit more EN efficient. However, it does not have the ability to chase down, which is fine though. This booster is supposed to be the one that is able to play really defensive and kiting very efficiently. I wouldn't even mind if they lifted the thrust up to replace the Alula's level. You have to chase the gills down. The gills can't chase you down, whereas the Alula can chase you down. However, it does not have the passive boost speed to make it a kiter in the same way that the gills does. So that would be the changes I make there. The 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 definitely needs work. I just honestly think that to lean into its assault boost thrust, I think making it so that it can close the gap and then use its one really powerful quick boost to dodge something would go a long way to helping it. I'm not sure why it has such bad EN consumption on the upward trajectory. that probably should go up. But I think the main problem with this booster is it doesn't have any way to close the gap, and it's also not very good at kiting because it's so slow. So one of those two weaknesses needs to be addressed, and it needs to pick a lane basically. Is this an offensive booster or is it a defensive booster? The mule, I'm not. I feel like that one's so niche. It's hard to balance that one around anything other than what it already does, which is just really good upward EN consumption. Maybe bringing up the upward thrust that would help it shine in that regard. It does kind of lack anything. And then adding melee attack EN consumption to be one of its top tier stats is silly. It doesn't have any melee attack thrust, so that has literally no place. There is no reason. Move that stat somewhere else. I don't know. Give it like a really strong QB thrust, or like so that it can dodge in the air really well would be nice in my mind. I already talked about the gills, and the Gridwalker's fine. The NGI booster is also one of the top tier boosters and one of the only meta ones. And you can tell because, again, it almost has 4 stats in S tier. It's a little off. 4 performance-based stats in S tier. AB thrust, upward thrust, and QB thrust. The QB thrust isn't quite in S tier, which is really what holds it back, I think, from being overpowered compared to something like the Alula. So yeah, that's all the changes in the boosters that I think are arguably needed. I'm going to run out of time here, so I do think that some of the generators do need work. Largely the VE20A has no niche compared to these two. So I would just say boosting its capacity to rival the Santai would be a good place, or maybe just bringing up the EN recharge and supply recover, or like the recovery stats, so that this one shines in that regard compared to these ones would be another way to do it. And then same thing goes for the aorta. It's just outclassed by the NGI 000. So those need to be addressed as well and rebalanced. But that's pretty much all the time I'm going to have. I hope that we'll see how my predictions pan out. And I'm pretty confident that most of these are not going to be done, but I feel like they should have been done if they were going to do a major patch, like one that's completely dwarfs the rest. Hopefully a lot of these issues get addressed, because we don't really need more gear in this game. What we need is for the 70% of the gear that's non-viable to just be fixed and brought up, and to bring down the things that are making so many of these things unviable, like the Acellus. So hopefully FromSoft takes some of these points to heart if they ever see this, or they've already seen some of my tickets and are responding in kind. I doubt it, but I do hope, and we'll see. And then maybe I'm coming back to Armored Core.